Welcome. My name is Robert Green. This is week 2 of History 363, Life and Death on the Eastern Front. Last week I shared with you some statistics on the comparative casualties sustained by the various combatant nations, and the Soviet figure, once again, is 26 million dead, with civilians accounting for as much as half of that total. What I'd like to do today is see how that happened, and consider the Eastern Front from a sort of bird's eye view perspective from above, and chart the narrative of the war in the East from Operation Barbarossa, the beginning of the Nazi war against the USSR, the invasion of the USSR by the Nazis on June 22nd, 1941, to the fall of Berlin, captured by the Soviet forces in May of 1945. So we'll consider a sort of broad chronological consideration of the war in the East, and it will give some context for the particular themes and topics that we'll be covering over the next several weeks, and in particular give some context for your readings and discussion questions for this week. So once we've charted the chronology of the period 1941 to 1945, I'd like to step back and consider sort of the big fundamental question here. How is it that the Nazis lost? How is it that the Soviets won? So, let's begin. Last week, we ended with a consideration of the 1939 Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And as I mentioned, each of the signatories to the Non-Aggression Pact appeared to have thought that it was buying time against the other. Take the Nazis. It was obvious to anyone who had read Mein Kampf, Hitler's political autobiography from the 1920s, that Hitler had designs on the East. And for Hitler, the Non-Aggression Pact was purely a delaying tactic of convenience that would permit the Germans to secure their position on the Western Front before turning east against Russia. And over the course of 1940, the first full year of war, the Nazi tactic of blitzkrieg appeared unstoppable. Blitzkrieg is a German word. It means lightning war. And it was a word, depending on the source you consult, it's a word either coined by the German General Staff or a word coined by German enemies in the field to describe German tactics. But in either case, blitzkrieg describes the style of rapid armored warfare that the Nazis deployed to enormous success over the course of 1940. The tactic involved throwing large amounts of heavy, powerful armored divisions, i.e. tanks, panzers, against the enemy, punching holes in the enemy line, and with the aid of artillery, air support, and infantry bringing up the rear, achieving thereby a swift and decisive victory against the enemy before the enemy had even a chance to fully mobilize. So, with the Nazi-Soviet pact in place by August of 1939, without having to fear any Soviet reprisals in the East, Hitler turned his attention to the West, and he invaded and swiftly defeated in short order Denmark, Norway, Holland, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France by the end of 1940. And here you see the map in front of you. In blue, the lands conquered and directly ruled by Hitler's Third Reich. Puppet regimes set up in the Slovak Republic, loyal client states established by this point in Hungary, Romania, and Vichy France. For Stalin, who had been, as we saw last week, railing against the threat of fascist aggression for more than a decade, the Non-Aggression Pact offered a much-needed breathing space. The thinking on the part of the Soviet General Staff and Stalin himself was that Hitler and the Western Allies would exhaust each other in this war, and thus the fascist threat would be lessened. The fascists would expend all of their energy against the Western armies. But when France, which had the largest army in Europe, fell to the Nazis in just a matter of weeks in the spring of 1940, Stalin then began to worry. Couldn't they have put up any resistance? He asked his closest advisors. So with the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact, the kind of anti-fascist propaganda like this that had been so prevalent in the USSR for most of the 1930s came to an immediate end. It was no longer politically palatable to display images such as this, railing against the fascist threat when the Nazis and the Soviets had shaken hands and come to this agreement. So images like this were pulled from public view. Public messages were altered. New images, even modes of entertainment, were altered for public consumption, even in the field of film and cinema. This is a poster for the film Alexander Nevsky, which premiered in February of 1939, just 6 months before the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact. It was pulled from theaters, from Soviet theaters, directly following the signing of the pact. Why? The film, if you've seen it, and if you haven't seen it, you should. It's one of the sort of classics of Soviet cinema. Tells the story of a medieval Russian prince from the 13th century, Alexander Nevsky. And Nevsky had rallied his people, the Russian people, against the invading German crusaders, the Teutonic Knights. And in the climactic scene in the film, there's a battle fought atop the frozen lake, and the ice cracks, and the Germans are destroyed, literally swallowed up by Mother Russia. The film is directed by the great Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. The score was composed by the great Soviet composer Sergei Prokofiev, and is regarded again as a masterpiece of Soviet cinema. Now, the idea of Red Russia devouring fascist aggressors was seen as a positive when the film was approved and shot in 1938, released to Soviet theaters in February of 1939, but now, with the signing of the pact, it was, of course, impossible to screen, and it was silently pulled from theaters. Of course, it would be re-released, amidst much hype, just 2 years later, when the German invasion now all of a sudden made the film timely once again. And so the film was put back into theaters to rally popular support. We'll talk more about Soviet means, the Soviet regime's means for building up popular enthusiasm for the war over the next couple of weeks. One of the big questions that historians grapple with in thinking about the war on the Eastern Front is the question of preparedness. That is to say, was the USSR ready for war in 1941? The answer, I think, has to be somewhat ambivalent. It's both yes and no. On the eve of the Second World War, the USSR was the world leader in several vital strategic economic areas. First place in the world for the extraction of manganese ore, which was essential for the production of armored tanks. The USSR was first place in the world in the production of synthetic rubber. The #1 oil producer in Europe, #2 in the world. In steel, cast iron, aluminum, all key military commodities. In those key areas, the USSR was the second largest producer in Europe, the third largest in the world. In terms of coal and cement production, the Soviets held third place in Europe, fourth place in the world. Altogether, the Soviet Union accounted for 10% of world industrial production in 1939. And again, this industrial upsurge is entirely a product of Stalin's economic policies, the so-called 5-year plans, the first of which had debuted at the end of the 1920s. Part of Stalin's larger project, right? This drive to industrialize Russia to make the USSR into a modern, technologically advanced power. This Soviet poster from the 1930s contrasts the style and nature of work in pre-revolutionary Russia, shown on the left, right? The sort of manual, back-breaking work, the kind of work that was performed under the Tsarist regime, the poster tells us, in 1913. Contrast that with the way in which work is performed under the Soviet regime, thanks to Comrade Stalin, by 1932. Mechanized, modernized. The worker is not bowed down by the instruments of his production, but stands tall. Right? He is not subdued by his materials. He has mastered his materials. Right? And at the very bottom of the poster, you see all of these little charts and pie graphs and whatnot showing you pre- and post-revolutionary industrial output. So a typical 1930s Soviet poster celebrating the achievements of Soviet industry, the credit to which was given entirely to Stalin. So when we think about war preparedness, on the economic front, on the sort of productive front, the Soviets were well prepared. And again, images like this make it clear that Stalin gets credit for industrializing the Soviet economy, creating through a mixture of enthusiasm and coercion the kind of infrastructure, the rail lines, the systems of factories that put the USSR on a war footing. That's true. We have to bear in mind also, however, that Stalin's purges had gutted the military. The purges that Stalin launched against the Soviet army leadership and general staff in 1937-38 had certainly had a negative, adverse effect on Soviet preparedness for war. The purges, which were launched by the party against itself and aimed at rooting out enemies, rooting out supposed oppositionists and wreckers who had wormed their way into the party, who were agents of fascism, who were conspirators working hand in glove with Trotsky and other enemies of Soviet power. The purges decimated the party. The purges decimated the Soviet industrial infrastructure. Factory managers, old Bolsheviks, professors, students, writers, cultural figures, but the military was particularly devastated by the purges of 1936, 37, and 38. Just to give you a few statistics, 3 out of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, equivalent to 5-star generals in this country, 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union fell in the purges. 13 of the Red Army's 15 commanders, 8 of the Red Army's 9 admirals, 50 of the Red Army's 57 corps commanders. Out of 186 division commanders, 154 were arrested and shot in the purges. All 16 of the Red Army's chief political commissars, 25 of 28 Army Corps commissars. Excuse me. So further down the chain of command, the losses were less devastating. But in essence, what happens here is that Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had decapitated a war-experienced officer corps and considerably undermined the USSR's ability to defend itself when war came. And Hitler was confident that with its most celebrated leaders dead or languishing in prison or in disgrace, the Red Army would be no match for the Germans. The USSR's disastrous campaign against Finland in 1939-1940 seemed to bear out Hitler's confidence. Finland, as you may know, had been part of the Russian Empire under the Tsars prior to 1917. And once the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was in place, Stalin sought to take advantage of the opportunity to bring Finland back into Moscow's control. And the so-called Winter War began when the Red Army, the Soviet Army, invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939. They outnumbered the Finns by at least 2-1, but the Soviets were simply outfought. The inexperienced Red Army leadership was outcommanded by their Finnish counterparts. The Finns destroyed Soviet tanks with homemade Molotov cocktails. They outmaneuvered the Soviet army. Finnish troops were able to negotiate that difficult terrain on skis, as you can see here, while the Soviets were frozen and immobile. Realizing that in a drawn-out war, they would inevitably lose to the numerically superior Soviets, the Finnish government sued for peace. And after just 100 days of fighting, the Soviets signed a treaty with Finland that recognized Soviet control over these territories in red. And it was a great victory over Finnish aggression, the Soviet newspapers boasted. But these islands in the Gulf of Finland, this territory known as Karelia, Sala, and the Ribachi Peninsula up here in the far north. So these red territories were taken from Finland by the Winter War and annexed to the USSR. One Soviet general was said to have remarked, confidentially, not in public, "We have won just enough territory to bury our dead." And Soviet casualties in this short winter war, just 3 months of fighting, Soviet casualties came to more than 50,000 dead, 100,000 wounded. Again, 90 days of fighting. That's more than twice the casualties suffered by the Finns. I mention the Winter War because the Soviet Union's pitiful performance against tiny Finland gave Hitler further confidence that when he brought war to the USSR, it would be swift. On December 18th, 1940, Hitler signed Directive Number 21, authorizing the invasion of the Soviet Union. And it was set for the following summer, 1941. As you can see from this map, non-aggression pact or no, German troops were amassing in Eastern Europe in the spring and early summer of 1941. What this map shows you is that by June 1st, 1941, there were nearly 120 German divisions positioned on or within striking distance of the Soviet border. 120 divisions. Now, Stalin appears to have completely failed to notice, or pretended not to notice, these obvious German preparations for war in the East. In the last 2 months before the invasion, over the course of April, May, and into June of 1941, Stalin received several reports from a variety of intelligence sources, diplomatic channels, espionage cables, warning that Hitler intended to launch an invasion, and soon, against the USSR. The amount of the amount of information, the amount of intelligence coming into Moscow at this point was simply overwhelming. The Soviet military attaché in Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, cabled Moscow to report that Nazi plans for an invasion of Great Britain had been shelved, and that all of Hitler's efforts were now being directed for an invasion of the USSR. The military attaché warned his Soviet comrades, "We must be ready for this. It's coming." The top Soviet agent in Bucharest, Romania, cabled Moscow to report that the Germans would invade in the summer of 1941. Full stop, period. Intelligence sources stationed in Hungary, Italy, Bulgaria, confirmed that the Germans were going to invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 41. The British government, the US government, cabled secret warnings to Moscow. Stalin refused to countenance any such evidence, dismissing them as provocational rumors. Even when Soviet intelligence agents had managed to tunnel underneath the German embassy in the heart of Moscow and to take photographs of sensitive military documents which showed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Germans were going to invade the USSR, Stalin refused to take action on any of this. He said, "This is all just rumor, this is all just hearsay." Why? Recently, to answer that question, a scholar named David Murphy, who was the former chief of Soviet operations for the CIA, Murphy wrote a book called What Stalin Knew. And it's an interesting book. He argues in this book that the leadership in the Soviet military and Soviet intelligence were very cautious when it came to the reports that they presented to Stalin. and they would tailor the reports in such a way as to match what they anticipated would be Stalin's interpretation of the material. And since it was apparent to intelligence chiefs that Stalin did not want to believe a German attack was imminent, the intelligence reports that they delivered to Stalin echoed and reinforced their boss's views, and echoed and reinforced that stubborn way of thinking. So it was not a failure of intelligence per se. It was a failure born of fear to package and present that intelligence effectively to Stalin. And it's typical, I think, of the nature of decision-making and policy implementation in the Stalinist system. No one wants to be the bearer of bad news to Comrade Stalin. So despite the mass of information coming in from intelligence sources across Europe, the result is that the Soviet Union takes no defensive precautions against this obvious military buildup. As late as June 14th, 1941, just 1 week before the Nazi invasion, Stalin ordered the Soviet press office to issue a public statement dismissing rumors of the German troop buildup as nonsense, clumsy propaganda put out by forces hostile to Germany, the USSR, and their mutual beneficial alliance. That was the public message. Stalin sent a private cable to Hitler the week before, requesting official explanation for what's going on. No response came. Senior German officials refused to meet with Soviet diplomats. On June 21st, 1941, just hours before the invasion, Hitler wrote to Mussolini, his Italian ally, to say that he expected nothing less than full success in this, his Eastern campaign. "Whatever happens, Duce," Hitler wrote, "our position will not be worsened by this step. It can only be improved. I feel freer in myself now that I have taken this decision. I found cooperation with the Soviet Union very burdensome. For me, it seemed like a break with my past, my outlook, and my formal obligations. I am happy to have shed that moral burden." With Hitler having shed his moral burden, the invasion commenced. 3:15 a.m. Berlin time, 4:15 a.m. Moscow time, Sunday morning, June 22nd, 1941, the entire Soviet frontier erupted with artillery fire. 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south. Operation Barbarossa began, the Nazi invasion of the USSR, the single most powerful invasion force in human history up to that time. Operation Barbarossa was named for the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Redbeard, who had pushed German borders eastward against the Slavs back in the 1300s. And Hitler was aware that previous invasions of Russia from the west had all failed. He was determined that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Hitler lectured his generals, who of course knew far better than he, that Napoleon had failed to conquer Russia in 1812 because he had concentrated all of his forces in a single-pronged attack, thereby making lines of supply difficult to maintain as French forces pushed deeper and deeper into Russian territory. So, to avoid the mistakes of Napoleon, to avoid the French failure of 1812, Hitler decided we, in 1941, will invade Russia with a three-pronged attack. And so, the Nazis launched these three sort of primary theaters of attack into the Soviet Union, each with its own timetable, each with its own strategic objectives. Army Group North, as you see, in the north, supported by Finnish troops who were eager to exact revenge against the Soviets, Army Group North moved against the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The goal was to close off Soviet access to supply lines by sea so that no supplies could come in via the Baltic. Their goal was to take the strategic center of Leningrad and, if necessary, provide a point from which the German army could then strike further east against the great munitions factories and iron ore fields behind the Ural Mountains. That's Army Group North. Army Group Center, here in the center, was set to drive through what is now the independent country of Belarus and to strike all the way on the capital of Moscow. Meanwhile, Army Group South was to strike at Soviet Ukraine, capture Kiev and the Crimea, and then swing south to occupy the oil-rich Caucasus republics, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, to secure German access to Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. So the primary plan of this initial phase of the German invasion was to occupy pretty much all of European Russia, from Arkhangelsk in the north and the Arctic, all the way to the Caspian Sea in the south, even off of this map. And from there, if resistance was still being manifested by the Soviets, from there begin a series of strategic tactical airstrikes on Soviet factories and Soviet industrial bases and strangle the Soviets into submission, if it came to that. The Wehrmacht, the German army, attacked the USSR in the summer of 41 with the largest, most powerful military force ever assembled. 3.2 million soldiers, more than two-thirds of the German army in Europe. 600,000 trucks, 750,000 horses, more than 3,300 tanks, 2,000 combat aircraft, 7,000 artillery guns. The whole German thinking behind Barbarossa was that the Soviet Union could be taken by surprise and rapidly defeated, and thus Hitler would achieve absolute hegemony in Europe, allowing for the German race to fulfill its historical destiny of eastward expansion, Ostsiedlung. Hitler predicted to his generals, "We have only to kick in the front door, and the whole rotten Russian edifice will come tumbling down." And so it was with these confident assumptions that Hitler, the General Staff, and most of the 3.2 million ordinary men, soldiers, it was with those assumptions that this would be a short war that they marched against the USSR. The Nazis enjoyed spectacular success early on. The Soviets were taken completely by surprise and suffered high casualty rates. The Germans virtually destroyed the Red Army Air Force while it was still on the ground before it had a chance to scramble, thus ensuring that the Germans would have crucial air superiority in the early months of the war. Here you see one of just hundreds of Soviet planes destroyed by the Germans at the air base outside of Minsk in the Belarusian Soviet Republic. In the first days of the invasion, the Nazis destroyed more than 2,000 Soviet aircraft, losing only 35 of their own. By day 17, Army Group Center had captured 300,000 Soviet soldiers and captured or destroyed 2,500 tanks, 1,400 artillery, 250 aircraft. That's Army Group Center alone, just one of the three prongs of the Nazi invasion. These casualties are simply staggering. Here you see a photograph of Soviet prisoners of war on the left. We'll talk more about the casualty rates suffered by Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity, which were absolutely staggering. But with the Soviet losses and the rapid German advance, Hitler predicted to his generals that victory was right around the corner. In October of 41, Hitler declared, "I can say this enemy is already broken and will never rise again." Hitler predicted that by the end of the year, the swastika would fly over the Kremlin. And these maps give you some sense of the astonishing gains made by the Nazis in the early weeks of the war. June 22nd, by the beginning of July, and then by September, this next map shows you that by December of 1941, the Nazis had encircled Leningrad and were poised to strike the capital of Moscow. The early weeks of the war were characterized by great heroism on the part of ordinary Soviet men and women, but also by incredible, all but unthinkable incompetence on the part of the Soviet high command. As the Germans advanced, more and more Red Army units were cut off and encircled. They were forced to fight their way out or retreat, but in either case, disorganization prevailed. You see on this map in pink these surrounded Soviet pockets. The German advance was so swift that hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were simply encircled. As the Germans advanced again, Soviet troops cut off. They attempted to contact superiors. They attempted to contact Moscow for instructions, but received little in the way of guidance. To give you an example, Nikita Khrushchev, the Communist Party boss of Soviet Ukraine at the beginning of the war, telephoned the Kremlin shortly after the invasion to speak with Stalin, but could only get a hold of Georgy Malenkov, one of Stalin's less helpful functionaries. And in his memoirs, Khrushchev records the bizarre conversation that he had on the phone with Malenkov. Khrushchev says, "Tell me, where can we get rifles? Kiev needs rifles. The Germans are coming." He says, "We've got factory workers here in Kiev who want to join the ranks of the Red Army and fight the Germans. We don't have anything to arm them with." In Moscow, Malenkov answers, "Well, you'd better give up any thought of getting rifles from us. The rifles here have already been sent to Leningrad." Khrushchev, at this point, a very voluble, excitable chap, begins to get angry and starts shouting, "What are we supposed to fight with?" "I don't know," Malenkov answers. "Swords, pikes, homemade weapons, anything that you can make in your own factories." Khrushchev says, "You mean we should fight tanks with spears?" "Well, you'll have to do the best you can," Malenkov says. "You could make fire bombs out of bottles of gasoline and throw them at the tanks." At which point, Khrushchev slammed down the phone. So, needless to say, spears or no spears, Kiev fell to the Germans. And outside Kiev alone, 500,000 Red Army men were encircled and either captured or killed. What happened at Kiev happened up and down the front, and what that almost comical, surreal conversation between Khrushchev and Malenkov reveals is that in the early weeks of the war, you have a complete breakdown of the Stalinist command system. Frontline officers, government party officials on the ground receiving little help or conflicting orders from Moscow. And so, confronted with that reality, actors on the ground, local commanders, local officials, implemented a policy that, consciously or not, mimicked the Russian strategy of the Napoleonic Wars 130 years before, namely retreat. Retreat, regroup, draw the Germans in deeper, stretch out the German lines. The Soviet retreat was marked also by what we would call a scorched earth policy. The total destruction of anything that could prove useful to the advancing German army. That means bridges and buildings were blown up, crops and food stores that could not be evacuated were burned, fuel and ammunition supplies that could not be evacuated were destroyed, railroad lines were torn up, etc., etc. The result of that was that when the Nazis took a town or city in Soviet Ukraine or Belarus, there was often little left to occupy. As you can see in this photograph, the Wehrmacht lifts the Nazi flag over a town that has been destroyed by the retreating Soviets. By the fall of 1941, Hitler's invasion was more or less on schedule. Army Group North had reached the gates of Leningrad, preparing for the 900-day siege that would claim the lives of 1 million people, 800,000 Leningraders from starvation, 200,000 from German bombs and artillery. Hitler declared St. Petersburg, Leningrad, must be erased from the face of the earth. We have no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. Leningrad must die of starvation. Again, we see this determination to not simply defeat the Soviet enemy on the field, but to destroy him where he lived. And the refusal on the part of the Nazis to draw distinctions between combatants and civilians. And this conviction, too, that the inferior Slavic enemy should be shown no mercy. Right? All of these ideological convictions put into practice made the siege of Leningrad, the 900 days, the most brutal siege in modern history. We'll talk more about that and read more about that in the weeks to come. Further to the south, Hitler's plan was to take Moscow by the end of 1941. And this push, as they called it, was Operation Typhoon. And again, just to remind you, here we see Moscow, the Soviet capital, right here, and the Nazis, the Germans, are poised to take Moscow in December of 1941. One final heave, Hitler told General Alfred Jodl, and we shall triumph. So Operation Typhoon, and here you see a map for Operation Typhoon. Operation Typhoon called for a surge offensive against the Soviet capital. The German general, Field Marshal von Bock, had 1 million men at his disposal. Half of all German troops on the Eastern Front were thrown into Operation Typhoon to capture Moscow. 75% of all German tanks on the Eastern Front, a third of all German combat aircraft. Typhoon was supposed to be a massive, full-blown effort to take Moscow by year's end. It failed. As the Russian winter set in, the German advance ground to a staggering halt outside the Soviet capital. It had been a wet and muddy autumn that year, and the winter of 1941 into 1942 was said to have been the worst in Russia for 100 years. Undoubtedly, that's some hyperbole. Winters are always pretty lousy in Russia, but this was a particularly bad one. Outside of Moscow, temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero. 30 degrees below zero. Without antifreeze, and the German tanks did not have antifreeze, this was supposed to be a quick campaign after all. Without antifreeze, the German panzers, tanks, could not start. Those that did could not maneuver effectively, even reliably, in the frozen snow and mud. We know from German soldiers' letters and diaries that their machine guns were crusted in ice. Recoil liquid froze in the guns. Mortar shells, when fired, would just fall into the snow with a thud, undetonated. Warm winter clothing was in perilous supply, and the German supply lines were far too long. Again, think about the incredible logistical difficulties in supplying more than 3 million German soldiers up and down a 2,000-mile front that is itself 2,500 miles from Berlin. Let's go back to this map of the three army groups. I think it gives you some sense. Excuse me. Army Group Center, again, which was the main thrust on Moscow, Army Group Center. Army Group Center required 120 trainloads of supplies every day. Food, ammo, gear, etc. On a good day, only 100 trainloads arrived by December of 1941. And when the weather was worse and Soviet partisan activity behind the lines was particularly fierce, and we'll talk about the Soviet guerrilla war in weeks to come, when the weather was bad and the partisans were active, far fewer supplies even than that could arrive. There's a new book by historian David Stahl about Operation Typhoon called Operation Typhoon. And in that book, Stahl argues that by 1941, by the end of 1941, with men freezing, with German soldiers dying of cold by the thousands, German morale had reached an all-time low. when a few generals suggested to Hitler that he might consider pulling his forces back for the winter, the Fuhrer refused. He was said to have remarked, "Is it any less cold 50 miles back?" The Germans suffered 250,000 losses outside of Moscow in the winter of 1941. The Soviets more than 2 or 3 times that. But with a difference. More and more Soviet soldiers could be and were being conscripted. And once Soviet agents in Tokyo confirmed that Japan was not going to attack the USSR, Stalin could move Soviet troops westward from Central Asia and Siberia. So Soviet reinforcements were coming in every day, while the Germans were losing troops that they simply could not replace. Here you see a photograph of fresh troops moving out of Moscow in the winter of 1941, heading for the front. And when this photo was taken, the front was less than 15 miles away, 15 miles outside the city. The failure of Operation Typhoon, the Battle of Moscow, marks a major turning point. The Red Army regrouped and launched the first of its major counterattacks under General Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was later the supreme commander of the Red Army forces. And here on this map you can see the tide of the turn, or the turn of the tide, I suppose, here outside of Moscow, and then the Soviet push back in the first months of 1942. So the Battle of Moscow is a major turning point. It stops the German blitzkrieg in its tracks. It forces the Germans to abandon this quick victory scenario that they had dreamed of and to settle in for a protracted war which they were not prepared to fight and which they could hardly hope to win. Here you see a photograph of Muscovite women, women from the city of Moscow, digging anti-tank trenches outside the city to save the capital from the Germans. There's a great sense of heroic self-sacrifice that's going on here. If you go to Moscow today, chances are you'll fly into Sheremetyevo Airport, and as you drive from the airport into the city, there's a monument on the highway showing the limits of the farthest German advance in 1941. And here you see the monument. The closest German units in 41 claimed that from their positions outside the city, they could see the golden spires of the Kremlin. The tide turned after the Battle of Moscow, and the next great turn of the tide came at the Battle of Stalingrad. Here you see Stalingrad. Excuse me. Stalingrad was formerly known as Tsaritsyn, the Tsar's city. It had been renamed Stalingrad, Stalin's city, in 1925, and it was a major industrial center. Controlling the Volga River, which runs here, as you can see, controlling the Volga River would cut communication and supply for the Soviets. So the Germans were eager to capture the Volga. The fact that Stalingrad was on the Volga was almost incidental. The city was not of primary strategic importance, but it became important for the German High Command, for Hitler in particular. One of the German generals, Field Marshal Kleist, wrote in his memoirs after the war, "The capture of Stalingrad was subsidiary to our main aim. At the start, Stalingrad was no more than a name on the map to us. But it's a name on the map that seems to have hypnotized Hitler." Even when the German armies appeared in danger of encirclement outside of Stalingrad, Hitler refused to allow his generals, Kleist and von Paulus, to make a tactical retreat. Hitler clearly considered this battle to be a personal confrontation with Stalin, a chess game that was being fought outside and inside the city of Stalingrad. And you get a sense of the spirit of the German advance when you read the diary of Alfred Rimmer this week. He talks a lot about encirclements and rings and this and that, because there is a Soviet presence here. The Soviets are fighting back against that advance. At the end of August 1942, the German Sixth Army, under General von Paulus, reached the outskirts of the city. And after a month of fighting, the Germans took the city of Stalingrad. But the Soviets, under Marshal Zhukov, launched a counteroffensive to recapture the city. And by September of 1942, the fighting in Stalingrad was literally street to street. If you've seen the Hollywood film Enemy at the Gates, you get some sense of what the fighting was like. There's also a great German film called Stalingrad about the fighting. It gives you some sense of the brutality and just the sort of savagery of the fighting in the bombed-out city of Stalingrad. The best novelistic treatment, I think, is the novel Life and Fate by the Soviet dissident writer Vasily Grossman. But anyway, there's no shortage of great artistic, literary treatments of this terrible, terrible battle. Zhukov's counteroffensive eventually forced the Germans to make a choice, pull out of Stalingrad or face elimination. Hitler stubbornly refused to allow his armies to retreat. In fact, Hitler ordered von Paulus to stand fast to the last man and the last bullet. And as a result, 91,000 German soldiers were captured by the Soviets at Stalingrad. Here you see some of them, along with 24 German generals. Of those 91,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, only 6,000 ever made it back to Germany alive. By the time the Red Army drove the Germans out of Stalingrad, the city was in ruins. It was perhaps the most devastating battle of the entire war in Europe. Between the fall of 1942 and February of 1943, 750,000 German soldiers were killed, missing, or wounded at Stalingrad. The Soviets suffered more than 480,000 killed or missing, 650,000 wounded. 40,000 civilians were killed in the bombing and the fighting. Here you see some haunting images of the devastation. An aerial view of the city in rubble by February of 1943. The surrounding area, the city itself and the surrounding fields, were so riddled with spent shells and bits of shrapnel, grass could simply not grow after the war. Stalingrad is a major turning of the tide on the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the Germans were unable to mount any further large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. The initiative shifted to the Red Army. This map shows you the rapid advance of the Soviets in 1943, 1944, sweeping through the West, reclaiming Soviet territory and pushing into Eastern Europe, pursuing the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Of course, by the summer of 1944, the Allies, the Western Allies, Britain and the U.S., had opened up the long-awaited Second Front, right, with D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. 2 million Americans, British, Canadian troops storming the beaches of Normandy. It's a story we know. Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, all of that, right? When the Western Allies landed in France on D-Day, 80% of the German military strength was situated on the Eastern Front. After D-Day, the Germans now had to split their forces. Germany was caught between two sides. But still, again, the balance of forces fighting on the Western Front of Europe versus the Eastern Front is striking. Just to give you a statistic, by the end of 1944, there were 91 Allied divisions fighting in France, Belgium, and Holland against 65 German divisions, along a front that was 250 miles long. In the east, 560 Soviet divisions were fighting 235 German divisions along a 2,000-mile-long front and driving them rapidly back to the west. The Soviet army took the Polish capital of Warsaw in August of 1944, and by the end of 1944, they had swept through Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia. On April 26th, 1945, Soviet and American troops met for the first time at the Elbe River in eastern Germany. Just a few weeks later, here one of the most famous images of the war, a young Red Army soldier flying the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin, May 2nd, 1945. By the time Soviet forces reached Hitler's underground bunker, the Fuhrer had committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Soviets. May 9th, 1945, Victory Day, the Germans signed the unconditional surrender, bringing the Second World War, the Great Fatherland War, as the Russians call it to this day, to a close. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in just 12. So how and why, in the remaining moments we have here in this presentation, how and why did the Germans lose in Russia? Why did Operation Barbarossa, the largest invading force ever seen in human history, why did it fail? Why did the German army suffer its first major military setback and its most devastating military setback against the Soviets on the Eastern Front? Well, you could flip through the History Channel documentaries. If you have expanded cable packages, you could flip through History 2 and the military channels and all of this, and chances are at any one time you'll find a documentary about World War II. And one of the common tropes, one of the common themes that's reiterated again and again is the effect of the winter, the bitter cold, the bitter cold. That's quite true, particularly in the winter of 1941, as we saw outside of Moscow. But it was more than just the bitter weather that defeated the Germans. And I think this is very important to remember. Soviet military production, in the end, proved to be far higher than the Germans had expected it to be. And this was a problem because German planners knew that the blitzkrieg in Russia had to be quick. It had to be completed ideally by the end of 1941, because if it dragged out too long, German munitions production simply would not be able to keep up with Allied production levels. And with the entrance of the United States into the war after December 7th, 1941, that became truer than ever. We can see this by looking at the numbers. 1942 is a critical year here for military hardware production. 1942, 2/3 of European Russia occupied by the German army, 2/3 of Soviet industry knocked out of commission. The Russians still managed to produce 23,500 tanks, 25,000 airplanes, 34,000 guns. And during the same year, as you can see, Germany produced only 9,300 tanks, 15,000 planes, 12,000 guns. In each of these critical indices for military production, the Soviets are able to outproduce. Now that's staggering, especially when you consider just how much Soviet productive capacity had been crippled by the Nazis. By the end of 1941, 63% of Soviet coal production was in Nazi hands, 70% of iron production, 60% of steel, 60% of aluminum, 41% of the Soviet railroad network, 47% of grain production, all in Nazi hands. So it took colossal effort, colossal human effort, to counteract these incredible statistics. The Soviets ordered the almost miraculous relocation of industrial equipment and material eastward to get it out of the range of Nazi forces. Soviet engineers and construction crews dismantled whole factories brick by brick, packaged them onto rail cars, and shipped the wagons east beyond the Ural Mountains, where they were unloaded, unpacked, reassembled, and put back online to resume productive capacity. In Moscow alone, in October of 1941, as the Germans marched on the city, 80,000 rail cars took out 498 factories and industrial installations, removing them to points east, to the Urals, West Siberia, even further to Kazakhstan, Soviet Central Asia, getting them out of Nazi hands. By November of 1941, 1.5 million trucks and 915,000 rail cars moved 1,500 industrial enterprises to the east, out of reach of the Germans. And by the middle of 1942, 80% of those factories had been reassembled and put back online, resuming productive capacity sometimes in as short as just a matter of weeks. The very first T-34 tanks built by the Soviets rolled off the factory lines just 2 weeks after the last team of engineers had left Kharkiv ahead of the German armies. And these relocated factories were rough places. They were without heat, sometimes even without proper roofs and windows, functioning round the clock, churning out as much material as possible to stop the Nazi advance. Along with the equipment, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people had to be moved as well. Skilled laborers, workers, technicians, engineers, with their families, wives, children, husbands. A monumental state effort. A monumental effort. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union produced 18 million rifles, carbines, and submachine guns, 95,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 109,000 combat aircraft. This wartime factory poster says, "Everything for the front, everything for victory." And it has a quotation from Stalin at the front. Give us more, at the top. Give us more tanks. Give us more anti-tank weapons. Give us more planes. Give us more mines. Give us more shrapnel. Give us more machine guns, etc., etc., etc. Give us more. And the man and woman here, the worker, cheek to cheek, reflects a kind of wartime reality. By the end of the war, 55% of the civilian workforce in the USSR were women. At the beginning of the war, that had only been 20%. And women obviously had to step up to fill the positions in factories that had been vacated by men going off to war. We see it in this poster. "We will take your place," the poster says. And you see this woman factory worker pulling on her gloves and setting into work as the men file past and the planes fly overhead. Women worked not only in the factories, but they fought in the Red Army. More than 800,000 Soviet women served in front-line combat roles, from snipers, machine gunners, to fighter pilots, and in the partisan guerrilla movement, which we'll talk about in a few weeks to come. All of this speaks, and I think, again, if we want to understand why the Soviets won, why the Nazis lost, yes, we can look at the Cold, yes, we can look at particular decisions made by Hitler, made by generals, made by members of the general staff, but the the sort of overriding factor here that helps us to explain the Soviet victory, I think, is the Stalinist regime's ability to mobilize totally the nation's resources, both human and material, for the war effort, to make production statistics like this possible. How the Soviet government was able to do that, and why Soviet citizens were receptive to their nation's call, is the subject we'll turn to over the next few weeks. Thanks for your patience. Again, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have by email or in the discussion forums, and I hope that we can chop up some of these topics more over the course of the week in our discussion forums. So, thanks very much. Let's have